Welcome to the Ripper Trials, where we ask, what if history's greatest legal minds stepped into the courtroom to defend the suspects of Jack the Ripper's reign of terror? In this debut episode, we present Sir Charles Russell, one of the finest defence lawyers of the Victorian era. Renowned for his razor-sharp cross-examinations and fearless pursuit of justice, Russell made history in 1888, the same year as the Ripper murders, when he defended Irish Home Rule leaders in the Parnell Commission, exposing forged evidence and dismantling the prosecution's case. Later, as the first Catholic Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales in over 2 centuries, he cemented his place as a master of courtroom strategy and integrity. Today, we imagine how Sir Charles Russell would defend Charles Lechmere, a man whose name has sparked endless debates in ripperology. Was Lechmere an innocent witness, or could he have been hiding in plain sight? The Ripper Trials is just beginning, and we want to hear from you. Like, share and subscribe to join the conversation, and let us know in the comments section, do you think Lechmere was guilty or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Your thoughts could shape the next great debate. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Charles Russell takes the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we gather here today not merely to evaluate the accusations levelled against Charles Allen Lechmere, but to stand as guardians of justice itself. For what is at stake in this courtroom is not only the legacy of a man long deceased, but the very principles upon which fairness and truth depend. We are asked to believe that this humble carman, a man devoted to his wife and children, is the shadowy figure who terrorized Whitechapel in 1888. Yet he is not here to defend himself. He cannot present evidence, challenge his accusers, or call upon witnesses to speak to his character. To declare him guilty without this is not only unjust, it is an assault upon the very foundations of justice. Imagine, if you will, the darkness of Whitechapel in those dreadful nights, a community shrouded in fear. Now imagine Charles Lechmere, a man on his way to work, stumbling into a nightmare not of his making, only to find himself, over a century later, accused of being the very monster he feared. And yet where is the proof? Where is the evidence that meets the burden required by this court? It is absent, replaced instead by conjecture, supposition, and a dangerous erosion of the principles of fairness. In this trial I will demonstrate how these accusations crumble under scrutiny. I will show you how the case against Lechmere is built not on fact, but on the shifting sands of confirmation bias. To condemn a man on such grounds would not only stain his name, but weaken the integrity of justice itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to remember as we proceed that it is not just Charles Lechmere who stands on trial today, it is the very idea of justice. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to the heart of this case, the evidence, or rather the lack thereof. I begin with a matter so fundamental that it precedes all others. The inescapable fact that Charles Allen Lechmere is not here to defend himself. He cannot face his accusers, cross-examine witnesses, or bring forth testimony that might illuminate the truth. And yet, despite this glaring absence, we are being asked to render judgment upon him, a judgment that could forever tarnish his name. This is not justice, ladies and gentlemen. This is conjecture untempered by scrutiny. Justice demands that every accused person be granted the opportunity to speak, to provide an account of themselves, to answer the charges laid against them. Yet Charles Lechmere, having passed from this life over a century ago, is afforded no such privilege. To hold him accountable in such circumstances is nothing less than an affront to justice itself. Imagine for a moment if any one of us were accused of a heinous crime long after our passing, unable to rebut the claims, to provide alibis, or to call upon the support of family and friends who knew us best. Would this be justice? No, it would be persecution, a trial in name only, conducted without the core principles that ensure fairness. I submit to you that this principle, the right of an accused to defend themselves, is not a mere procedural formality. It is the cornerstone of every fair trial. To ignore it here is to undermine not just this case, but the very integrity of our system of justice. The prosecution, if we may call it such, has the burden to overcome this immense barrier, and yet all they offer is the thinnest thread of circumstantial evidence woven into a tapestry of imagination. Now let us move to the second point of contention, the use of the name Cross by Charles Lechmere. The prosecution has portrayed this as a calculated act of deception, yet the facts reveal otherwise. In the 1861 census, we find Charles Lechmere, a boy of just 12 years, recorded as Charles Cross, adopting the name of his stepfather, Thomas Cross. This was a common and respectable practice in Victorian England, where stepchildren frequently took the surname of a step-parent who had assumed a paternal role. It was a reflection of familial unity, not deceit. By 1876, the name Charles Cross appears again, this time in connection with an incident reported the Islington Gazette on Friday, 29th December. This report concerns a tragic accident in which a young boy was struck by a vehicle operated by Lechmere. Importantly, the court found Lechmere entirely blameless in this matter, recognizing his conscientious and reliable nature. His testimony and conduct at the time reinforced his reputation as a dependable carman and a man of integrity. This timing is significant. By 1876, it seems likely that Lechmere was well into his career at Pickford's, one of the most reputable logistics companies of the era. If we consider the norms of Victorian working life, young men often began their careers in such roles between the ages of 16 and 18. This would place Lechmere's probable start date at Pickford's in the late 1860s or early 1870s, and it is logical to assume that he would have been hired under the name Charles Cross, a name associated with his family and one he consistently used in professional contexts. The use of the name Cross in this manner was both practical and logical. It ensured consistency in employment records and reflected the societal norms of the time. There is no evidence to suggest that this was an attempt to obscure his identity. To claim otherwise is to distort an entirely innocent decision into something sinister without foundation. Moreover, this pattern of transparent and consistent use of the name Cross further undermines the prosecution's narrative. If Lechmere were attempting to conceal his identity, why would he use the name so openly in police reports, court records, and his employment at Pickford's? Such behavior is wholly inconsistent with the notion of deliberate deceit. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the very definition of a red herring, a distraction from the real issues at hand. It is an attempt to cast suspicion where none is warranted, to paint an innocent and practical decision as something sinister. Justice demands that we see this for what it is, an irrelevance designed to mislead and confuse. Let us not be distracted from the absence of credible evidence linking Charles Lechmere to these heinous crimes. Let us now consider the conduct of Charles Lechmere on the morning he found the body of Mary Ann Nichols, a moment that the prosecution has twisted into the cornerstone of their accusations. They suggest that his actions and supposed inconsistencies point to guilt, but I say they reveal something far more mundane, the actions of a man running late for work, not those of one of history's most heinous murderers. Consider this. Lechmere himself admitted that he was behind schedule that morning. His usual departure time was likely closer to 3:20 a.m., yet on this day he may have left closer to 3:30 a.m., a small but significant delay for a man with a strict schedule. He knew that every minute counted, especially in a job like his, where tardiness could mean reprimand or worse. When he came across the body of Mary Ann Nichols, his actions were entirely consistent with someone who felt the heavy weight of his responsibilities. He stopped to inspect the scene but refrained from lingering. He spoke openly to Robert Poole and left the matter to be reported to the police officer he encountered. Even his refusal to touch the body, an act the prosecution paints as suspicious, can be explained by his urgency to get on with his commute and avoid further delay. And what of the so-called lies or inconsistencies in his statements? When asked about his timing, he gave an account that under scrutiny appears muddled. But is this surprising? Imagine being questioned about the precise minute you left your home days earlier, in a time when clocks were not as ubiquitous or precise as they are now. His confusion could easily stem from his anxiety about being late, a far more plausible explanation than the calculated deception of a cunning killer. Ladies and gentlemen, let us confront the sheer absurdity of the prosecution's theory. We are asked to believe that Lechmere was a diabolical murderer who staged this scene with extraordinary cunning. yet who simultaneously bungled his alibi by arriving late at the crime scene and giving inconsistent statements. Such a theory collapses under its own contradictions. What is far more reasonable is that Lechmere, an ordinary man with no criminal history, was simply trying to get to work on time. His every action, his hurried departure, his reluctance to delay further, and even his imprecise account of his timing, fits neatly into this explanation. To suggest otherwise is to leap into the realm of wild speculation, untethered from logic or evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, a man running late for work is not Jack the Ripper. To take the simple, human actions of Charles Lechmere and twist them into proof of monstrous guilt is an affront to reason and justice. Let us not be swayed by such fanciful distortions. Ladies and gentlemen, let us delve further into the so-called commuter killer theory, a narrative that paints Charles Lechmere as a man who transformed his daily route to work into a killing field. The prosecution would have us believe that Lechmere committed these heinous acts with surgical precision, seamlessly returning to his ordinary life without a trace of guilt or suspicion. Yet this theory, when subjected to the scrutiny it deserves, collapses under the weight of its own impossibilities, most glaringly, the timeline. Consider first the case of Mary Ann Nichols. Her death is estimated to have occurred at approximately 3:40 or 3:45 a.m., as determined by police and medical evidence. At this time, Lechmere was still present on Bucks Row, where her body was discovered. But here is where the prosecution's theory begins to unravel. Even if we assume Lechmere left Bucks Row immediately after encountering the body, he still faced a 25 to 30-minute walk to reach his place of employment at Pickford's. His shift began at 4 a.m., leaving him no time to spare. To suggest that he was both the killer and a punctual employee defies logic. He would not only need to commit the murder, but also clean himself of blood, dispose of any incriminating evidence, and resume his route, all within an impossibly tight time frame. Now let us turn to Annie Chapman, whose death exposes even greater flaws in the commuter killer theory. The coroner, based on forensic evidence, placed her time of death at approximately 5:20 to 5:30 a.m. For the prosecution to place Lechmere at the scene of the crime, they must discard this expert opinion and instead propose a time of death closer to 4 a.m., a figure unsupported by the medical evidence. But even if we grant them this 4 a.m. estimate, their theory still fails. Why? Because 4 a.m. is precisely the time Lechmere was required to be at work. If the prosecution's narrative is to hold, we must accept that Lechmere left his home late, committed a brutal murder at 4 a.m., and then managed to reach work in a presentable state. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not only improbable, it is impossible. The rigid schedule of a Victorian carman left no room for such atrocities. Lechmere's job at Pickford's was not one where tardiness or absences were tolerated, and his continued employment suggests that he maintained a consistent and reliable work ethic. And what of the psychological demands of such a crime? The FBI's 1988 profile of Jack the Ripper paints a picture of a killer who shared drinks with his victims, building trust before striking. This behavior is incompatible with the hurried schedule of a commuter. Are we to believe that Lechmere, a man en route to work, stopped to socialize with his victims, only to leave them mutilated in his wake? Such a scenario borders on the absurd. The theory also fails to account for the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, which occurred on a Sunday, when Lechmere was not commuting. If the prosecution wishes us to believe in a pattern, they must explain why this commuter killer deviated from it on this occasion. The truth is that the theory is riddled with inconsistencies, relying on selective interpretation of the facts and a willingness to bend timelines to suit preconceived notions. Perhaps most damning of all, the prosecution's timeline demands a presumption of guilt. Take the case of Annie Chapman once more. To fit Lechmere into the timeline, we must assume he is guilty from the outset, dismiss the coroner's findings, and twist the evidence to match this assumption. This is confirmation bias in its purest form. It is not an investigation seeking truth, but a narrative seeking a villain. Ladies and gentlemen, the commuter killer theory asks us to suspend logic, abandon evidence, and accept a sequence of events that is impossible to reconcile with the realities of time, place, and human behavior. It demands that we believe Charles Lechmere was both a meticulous killer and a punctual employee, a social predator and a hurried commuter, a man whose ordinary life was somehow punctuated by extraordinary violence. Such a theory is not just flawed, it is a flight of fancy, unsupported by the facts. Justice demands more than convenient theories. It demands facts, reason, and fairness. And when we apply these principles to the commuter killer theory, it falls apart completely. Charles Lechmere was not a killer stalking the streets of Whitechapel. He was simply a man on his way to work, caught up in a tragedy he did not create. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now consider the psychology of the perpetrator who committed these heinous crimes. A dark and complex mind driven by hatred, compulsion, and opportunity. We must ask ourselves whether this profile aligns in any way with the life, actions, and temperament of Charles Lechmere. The answer, as we shall see, is a resounding no. The 1988 FBI profile of Jack the Ripper provides a chilling glimpse into the likely character of the murderer. It describes an individual consumed by intense misogyny, deeply familiar with his victims, and likely to have built trust with them before striking. The killer is portrayed as socially maladjusted, volatile, and driven by a compulsion that escalated over time. These are not the traits of a man like Charles Lechmere, a family man who lived a stable, orderly life, free of any known history of violence or animosity toward women. Consider the lives of the victims. All suffered from severe alcoholism, a condition that often rendered them vulnerable to predators who could exploit their trust. The FBI profile suggests that the Ripper likely shared drinks with his victims, using the pretense of camaraderie to gain their confidence. But how does this align with the prosecution's commuter killer theory? Are we to believe that Lechmere, a man rushing to work on a tight schedule, stopped to socialize with his victims, perhaps at a pub or in an alley, before committing these monstrous acts? The timeline simply does not allow for such behavior. Moreover, let us turn our attention to the character of Charles Lechmere himself. Here we find no trace of the intense misogyny or deviant behavior described in the Ripper's profile. Lechmere was a man who provided for his large family, maintaining a stable home life over decades of marriage. He lived with his wife and 6 children at the time of the murders, and there is no evidence, none whatsoever, of any violent tendencies or psychological instability. Such a man is utterly incompatible with the profile of a killer driven by hatred and compulsion. The Ripper's crimes were not ordinary murders. They were acts of extraordinary brutality, fueled by a pathological need for dominance and destruction. The mutilations inflicted on the victims speak to a deep-seated rage, one that cannot be hidden or suppressed. A man capable of such acts would leave a trail of signs, erratic behavior, escalating violence, or troubling incidents in his past. Yet Charles Lechmere's life is devoid of such indicators. There is no history of cruelty, no pattern of aggression, and no suggestion of the psychological torment that would drive such a killer. Ladies and gentlemen, to cast Lechmere as the Ripper requires us to ignore these critical psychological factors entirely. It asks us to believe that a mild-mannered, hard-working family man could transform into a savage killer during his morning commute, only to revert to his ordinary self by the time he reached work. Such a transformation defies not only logic but the very principles of human psychology. Justice demands that we base our conclusions on evidence, not conjecture. And the evidence here is clear. The mind of Jack the Ripper, as dark and twisted as it was, bears no resemblance to the life and character of Charles Lechmere. To conflate the two is not only a mistake, but a grave injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to a vital consideration in this case: the existence of alternative suspects and the fundamental principle that the burden of proof lies entirely with the prosecution. To condemn Charles Lechmere as the culprit is not merely to assert his guilt, but to do so while disregarding more plausible suspects who were investigated and implicated by the authorities of the time. Let us remind ourselves of the burden of proof. It is not enough to point to Charles Lechmere and declare him guilty based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. The prosecution must prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that he alone could have committed these crimes. Yet they failed to do so because other suspects not only existed but were far more compelling based on the evidence available. Take, for example, Aaron Kosminski, a man who was considered by several senior officers at Scotland Yard to be the Ripper. Unlike Lechmere, Kosminski displayed behaviours that align closely with the psychological profile of the killer: paranoia, instability, and misogyny. He was known to harbour animosity toward women and reportedly suffered from severe mental illness. He was placed under surveillance following the murders, and soon after he was committed to an asylum. Notably, the killings ceased after his confinement. Then there is Montague John Druitt, another plausible suspect. Druitt was a barrister and schoolmaster whose death by suicide in late 1888 coincided with the cessation of the Ripper murders. Some contemporaries of the time believed Druitt's psychological struggles and proximity to Whitechapel during the murders made him a credible suspect. Even Louis Diemschutz, the man who discovered Elizabeth Stride's body, has been suggested as a possible suspect. Stride's murder is particularly contentious because it may have been interrupted and her wounds lacked the extensive mutilations seen in other Ripper cases. Diemschutz's discovery of her body could be interpreted as an attempt to control the scene rather than as an innocent act. And let us not forget the gang theories surrounding earlier victims like Emma Smith and Martha Tabram. Smith survived an attack and described being assaulted by a group of men, while Tabram's murder bore the marks of two distinct weapons, suggesting multiple assailants. These theories, while speculative, point to broader possibilities that cannot be ignored. How then does the prosecution justify singling out Charles Lechmere? They do so not through evidence, but through confirmation bias, moulding facts to fit their theory while discarding any that contradict it. They rely on the Commuter killer narrative to implicate Lechmere, yet this theory cannot explain the murders that occurred on Sundays when he was not commuting. They dismiss the actions of other suspects, such as Kosminski or Druitt, despite these individuals having traits or circumstances far more consistent with the profile of Jack the Ripper. The burden of proof is not on the defence to prove Lechmere's innocence. It is on the prosecution to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And when other suspects present more plausible explanations, the prosecution's case collapses. Ladies and gentlemen, the existence of alternative suspects is not a mere distraction. It is a critical reminder of the flaws in the case against Charles Lechmere. To convict him in the face of such reasonable doubt is to abandon the principles of justice and fairness. Justice demands that we explore every avenue, consider every possibility, and ensure that no man is condemned without proof. And here the proof simply does not exist. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now confront a grave and insidious issue that has tainted the entire case against Charles Lechmere: the problem of confirmation bias. This dangerous tendency to interpret evidence in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs, while dismissing or ignoring anything that contradicts them, is the antithesis of justice. It is not how truth is found, but how it is distorted. From the outset, the case against Lechmere has been shaped not by evidence, but by a theory. And once that theory was formed, every detail, no matter how tenuous, was interpreted through the lens of his supposed guilt. Consider the timeline of the murders. For Mary Ann Nichols, her estimated time of death at 3:40 or 3:45 a.m. leaves Lechmere insufficient time to reach work by 4 a.m. This should have exonerated him. Instead, the prosecution argues that the time of death must be wrong. For Annie Chapman, the coroner placed her death between 5:20 and 5:30 a.m., which definitively clears Lechmere as he was already at work. But again, the prosecution dismisses this evidence, preferring an earlier time of death, closer to 4 a.m., simply to fit their theory. This selective use of evidence is the hallmark of confirmation bias. When facts align with the theory, they are embraced. When they do not, they are ignored, reinterpreted, or outright rejected. For example, Scotland Yard officials, including high-ranking detectives, suspected individuals like Aaron Kosminski and Montague Druitt. These men fit the psychological profile of the Ripper far better than Lechmere ever could. Yet these suspects are conveniently overlooked or discounted, simply because they do not fit the preconceived narrative. Take also the claim that Lechmere used the name Cross to deceive the authorities. This is pure speculation, unsupported by any evidence. Lechmere had been using the name Cross as early as the 1861 census, long before the murders took place. He likely adopted the name out of respect for his stepfather, Thomas Cross, and continued using it in professional contexts, including his job at Pickford's. Yet this entirely mundane explanation is discarded, and instead the name Cross is framed as a sinister attempt at concealment. Even the so-called commuter killer theory is riddled with confirmation bias. It relies on the assumption that Lechmere's route to work conveniently passed by the murder sites. But this theory falls apart when confronted with the Sunday murders, which did not coincide with his commute. Instead of reconsidering their theory, the prosecution simply ignores this glaring inconsistency, hoping we will not notice. Ladies and gentlemen, confirmation bias is a poison that clouds judgment and perverts justice. It leads us to see guilt where none exists, to twist facts to fit theories, and to condemn the innocent in the pursuit of a convenient narrative. To accuse Charles Lechmere based on such flawed reasoning is not only unfair to him, but it undermines the very foundation of justice itself. Justice demands objectivity. It requires that we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads us away from our initial assumptions. And when we examine the case against Charles Lechmere with clear eyes, free from the distortions of confirmation bias, we find not a cunning killer, but an ordinary man caught in extraordinary circumstances. He is not the villain of this story, but its victim, a victim of suspicion, prejudice, and the failure to uphold the principles of fairness. Let us not compound this injustice by succumbing to the problem of confirmation bias ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, as we near the conclusion of this case, let us revisit the timeline and the events on Bucks Row with greater precision. The prosecution claims that Charles Lechmere's timeline is improbable, insisting he could not have been so close to Robert Poole without being seen or heard. However, when we calculate the distances and consider the conditions of Bucks Row, their assertion unravels. Lechmere himself stated he left his home between 3:20 and 3:30 a.m. The prosecution contends this is untrue and implies a more nefarious timeline, yet it is far more plausible that Lechmere was simply running late, leaving closer to 3:35 or 3:36 a.m., and adjusted his account slightly to avoid admitting he was tardy for work. Now let us consider the proximity to Robert Poole. To remain just out of sight or hearing, Lechmere needed to be approximately 100 meters ahead of Poole. With an average walking speed of about 5 kilometers per hour, this distance represents roughly 1 minute and 15 seconds of walking time. This gap is entirely plausible. Bucks Row, dimly lit with gas lamps only at either end, left much of the street in deep shadows. Lechmere, moving quietly along the row, could easily have remained unseen, especially if he had only just arrived at the scene moments before Poole. Visual and auditory perception depends heavily on environmental factors, and the prosecution's assumption of clear visibility and silence is far from realistic. Let us also remember the sounds of the surrounding area. Bucks Row was close to Whitechapel Road, a thoroughfare that even in the early hours could carry the noise of horse-drawn carts, wagons, and other activity. Such ambient noise would easily drown out the sound of a lone walker. The idea that Poole should have heard Lechmere from 100 meters away is a flawed assumption, reliant on idealized conditions that did not exist. Thus, if Lechmere arrived on Bucks Row only moments before Poole, the sequence of events aligns perfectly with his account. He could have found the body of Mary Ann Nichols and barely begun assessing the scene before Poole joined him. There is no need to leap to far-fetched conclusions when such a straightforward explanation fits the facts so seamlessly. Ladies and gentlemen, the timeline presented by the prosecution demands leaps of imagination unsupported by evidence. The more plausible scenario is that Charles Lechmere, an ordinary working man running slightly late, found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. His every action that morning reflects concern, practicality, and the realities of his daily life, not guilt. Let us not convict him based on hypothetical scenarios when a simple, logical explanation exists. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have now examined every corner of the case against Charles Lechmere, a case rooted not in evidence but in speculation and conjecture. And as we approach the conclusion of these proceedings, it becomes clear that the accusations against this man, who lived an ordinary life of duty and responsibility, fail to meet the most basic standards of proof required for justice. Charles Lechmere was not a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. He was a hard-working carman, a family man, a provider. He was the husband of one wife and the father of at least 11 children, perhaps 12, though the precise count remains debated. These were not the actions of a man harbouring the hatred, volatility, or impulsive violence required to commit such monstrous acts. His was a life of stability and consistency, not of brutality and chaos. The prosecution would have you believe that this man, who navigated the challenges of supporting a large family in Victorian London, could somehow transform into one of history's most heinous murderers, all while maintaining his responsibilities, his job, and his family life without raising any suspicion. This narrative is not merely implausible, it is impossible. We have shown that the so-called commuter killer theory is riddled with flaws. The timeline of Mary Ann Nichols' death, at approximately 3:40 or 3:45 a.m., does not allow enough time for Lechmere to complete the murder and still reach work by 4 a.m. The coroner's determination that Annie Chapman died between 5:20 and 5:30 a.m. definitively places him elsewhere. Even if we grant the prosecution's speculative earlier timelines, they do nothing to explain how a man could commit such heinous acts and then arrive at work unflustered, unbloodied, and on time, or only slightly late. We have dismantled the prosecution's portrayal of Lechmere's use of the name Cross as an act of deceit. The evidence shows that this was a name he used consistently in professional and legal contexts, beginning as early as 1861, in honour of his stepfather. There is no sinister implication, only the mundane reality of Victorian naming customs. We have also exposed the glaring problem of confirmation bias, the selective interpretation of evidence to suit a preconceived narrative. Whether it is the timelines of the murders, the actions of Lechmere on Bucks Row, or the disregard for alternative suspects such as Aaron Kosminski or Montague John Druitt, the prosecution has consistently prioritised theory over fact. And most importantly, we have reminded you that the burden of proof lies entirely with the prosecution. To convict Charles Lechmere of these crimes, you must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he and he alone committed them. Yet at every turn, doubt abounds. The timeline, the psychology, the logistics, and the alternative suspects all lead to one inescapable conclusion. The case against Charles Lechmere is not proven. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Lechmere was not Jack the Ripper. He was a man devoted to his family, a man who shouldered the burdens of fatherhood for at least 11 children, and a man whose name and legacy now stand unjustly tarnished by baseless accusations. To condemn him without definitive proof would be to abandon the principles of fairness and justice that form the foundation of this court. I urge you to let reason guide your decision. Acquit Charles Lechmere, and allow history to remember him not as a monster, but as a man caught in the tragic circumstances of his time. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the fairness of a jury's verdict in this case depends on their ability to adhere to the principles of justice and reason, resisting the pull of emotion and speculation. The law demands that the prosecution prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If the jury follows this principle faithfully, the circumstantial and speculative nature of the case against Charles Lechmere should lead them to a verdict of not guilty. However, we must also confront the realities of human nature. The spectre of Jack the Ripper looms large over this case, inflaming passions and shaping biases. The gruesome details of the murders and the enduring mystery surrounding them create an environment where suspicion can easily outweigh evidence. It is all too tempting for a jury to seek closure, to find someone to blame, and to assign guilt where proof is lacking. Thus, the outcome rests on the jury's ability to set aside these temptations and focus solely on the evidence, or lack thereof. They must recognize the prosecution's reliance on conjecture and their failure to eliminate reasonable doubt. They must see Charles Lechmere for what he is, Not a shadowy figure from folklore, but a man whose presence at the scene of a tragedy has been twisted into something sinister without sufficient cause. In sum, while a fair jury should reach a verdict of not guilty, the path to such a verdict is fraught with challenges. The defence must counter not only the prosecution's case, but also the biases and emotions that inevitably accompany a case of this nature. It is a difficult task, but not an impossible one.
Sir Charles Russell's defence has left us with much to consider. While the debate over Charles Lechmere's guilt or innocence continues, the enduring mystery of Jack the Ripper remains as compelling as ever. Before we dive into the references that informed this discussion, it's important to note that most artificial intelligence implementations are not particularly adept at ripperology. However, they excel at adopting the perspective of historical figures with substantial writings and documented viewpoints. For this reason, we've employed the latest AGI engine from ChatGPT to take on the perspective of Sir Charles Russell, training this session on carefully selected reference materials to craft his defence. Now, we want to extend our highest praise to the incredible references that inform this discussion. Each offers a wealth of insight, whether you agree with their conclusions or not, and they are invaluable for anyone exploring this case. 1. The Complete Jack the Ripper by Donald Rumbelow. This foundational book is unmatched in its detail and scope. While some argue it portrays Lechmere with more innocence than is justified today, it remains essential reading for anyone interested in the Whitechapel murders. 2. The 1988 FBI profile of Jack the Ripper. Short but powerful, this profile offers a fascinating psychological perspective on the killer. Though its 1988 view of psychopathy may feel dated, it's still an important milestone in understanding the case. 3. Krista Holmgren on The Missing Evidence, Jack the Ripper. Krista Holmgren presents a bold case against Lechmere, arguing it could succeed in court today. His book Cutting Point, Solving the Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Murders, offers even more insight and is highly recommended. 4. The YouTube channel Inspector Aberline. Inspector Aberline's careful analysis of Lechmere is both methodical and compelling. Videos like The Crown vs. Lechmere are thought-provoking and well worth watching. 5. The YouTube channel Jack the Ripper Tour. This channel's open-minded approach to Ripper theories is refreshing, and its friendly, engaging interviews allow advocates to present their cases in detail. It's an excellent resource for understanding the theories and their proponents. 6. The YouTube channel House of Lechmere. With over 20 red flags presented against Lechmere, this channel builds a meticulous circumstantial case. Their videos, including profiling Jack the Ripper, are invaluable for anyone investigating this suspect. Thank you for joining us on the Ripper Trials, History's Greatest Defences. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was Charles Lechmere guilty or just an unlucky bystander? Your theories might just inspire the next great debate. Stay tuned for the next episode.